Breakups are ugly. Watching your best friend turn yours into content felt uglier. In Austin, I managed communications for a local coffee roaster and tried to keep life neat. Tidy inbox, measured words, conflict avoided whenever possible. There's a type of friend who treats access as a currency. He believes proximity grants permission. Max was that friend. He talked about capturing moments, like he was preserving history, when really he chased engagement like a fisherman chasing schools of flashing bait. You know the type, the one who calls honesty raw, as long as it benefits him. People like me enable them. Pleasers make great stages. We are quiet, available, and too slow to close the curtain. The breakup wasn't dramatic. Erin and I were simply done pretending our timelines matched. She wanted grad school in Seattle and a quieter partner. I wanted Austin, a promotion, and room to be indecisive. You, listening, might think endings should be private, even tender. That's the civilized myth. In practice, endings expose the hierarchy of values. Erin valued clean exits. I valued not upsetting anyone. Max valued eyes on screens. He'd come over to check in, hovering near the kitchen island, saying he wouldn't intrude. Boundary testers never kick down doors. They lean and smile until the hinge gives. I didn't notice the phone at first, angled between a succulent and a French press, screen facing our living room. Chat boxes are just confetti until you read the words. A viewer count bloomed like mold in the corner. 187, 412, 1, 2K. He titled it something chirpy, nothing cruel, just efficient. The algorithm loves instruments without conscience. It rewards speed, novelty, and the hint of blood. If you've ever paused on a train wreck, you know what fueled the counter. Don't pretend you're immune. None of us are. Not really. Erin caught it before I did. Max, is that live? She asked, not angry yet, just tired. I felt an old, pathetic instinct crawl up my spine. Make this smooth. Make this nice. Don't make a scene. That instinct is how friendships like ours metastasize. People say betrayal arrives like a knife. It's closer to 1,000 rubber stamps, each one reading okay. The comments surged. I stepped between his lens and our lives. End it, I said, finally choosing a verb that didn't apologize. Max gave this little shrug that said the crowd was a weather event he couldn't stop. And for once, I didn't negotiate. I reached for the phone. The screen went dark in my hand, but not before the last surge of emojis scattered across it. In silence, the room felt strange, like oxygen had been sucked out and replaced with residue. Erin shook her head and grabbed her tote, muttering that she'd call later. She didn't. Endings have their own etiquette. Some slam, some fade. Ours bled into the grain of that night like spilled coffee, staining everything I thought was solid. Max tried to laugh it off. Man, people do this all the time. Couples vlogging, breakup TikToks. Authenticity sells. That word authenticity is a mask people wear when they mean exploitation. If you've ever justified an intrusion by calling it real, you've crossed the same line. You might not live stream a breakup, but maybe you've repeated a secret because it was too good not to share. That's the same instinct, scaled differently. What struck me wasn't his betrayal, but my predictability. He gambled correctly that I wouldn't erupt. Friends like him orbit around the polite ones, because outrage is currency and restraint is fertile soil. Jung would say he carried the archetype of the trickster, forever testing limits under the guise of humor. But here's the provocation. Who enables the trickster more, him for acting, or me for tolerating? Think about your own circle. Who records instead of comforts? Who narrates instead of listens? They exist everywhere, in office kitchens and group chats, and they thrive when no one resists. I told him flatly that he had crossed a line. He countered with half apologies laced in self-justification. It was trending. People related. It could even help you move on. There it was, the conversion of pain into product. I didn't argue. Instead, I realized something heavier than anger had settled in me. The awareness that boundaries unspoken aren't boundaries at all. Max finally left, annoyed I hadn't appreciated his platform. Alone, I stared at my phone. Notifications buzzed with tagged clips already circulating, reactions from strangers dissecting my breakup like it was community theater. The private became public not through malice, but through casual entitlement. And the hardest part? A part of me already rehearsed how to excuse him next time. By morning, the clips had legs of their own. A neighbor texted, "Saw you on live last night. Are you okay?" That was the moment the circle of shame widened. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was public property. You know this feeling, don't you? When your life stops being yours because someone else frames it for you. Maybe it's a coworker who spreads a half-truth, or a family member who shares too much at Thanksgiving. You're left cleaning up an image you didn't approve. I spent most of the day at the office pretending nothing happened. In marketing, we called it controlling the narrative. Yet, here I was with no control at all. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced for another reminder that strangers had dissected the most private exchange of my year. The irony wasn't lost on me. I sold stories for a living, carefully crafted ones about coffee beans and community, while my own story was being sold raw, messy, and unsolicited. Max dropped by again that evening. He didn't knock, he never did. He breezed in with takeout like he was delivering peace offerings. "People loved it," he said, as though approval equaled forgiveness. He framed himself as the connector, the guy who turned life into shared experience. That's the archetype he clung to, the performer, the one who insists the spotlight heals. But here's the truth, performers need an audience more than they need friends. And if you're not careful, you stop being a person to them, you become material. I told him, calm but cold, that he had no right to decide what parts of my life were consumable. He countered with his usual shrug. "You're overthinking it. It's just content." That phrase carried more violence than shouting would have. Just content erases the personhood underneath. Think about the last time someone reduced your pain to entertainment or gossip. Didn't it hollow you out a little? The worst part was noticing the flicker of doubt in myself. Was I overreacting? Had I become too sensitive, too protective of an image that didn't matter in the long run? That inner voice was the echo of years spent smoothing conflict, making myself smaller for the sake of harmony. Max didn't invent that dynamic, he just weaponized it. And as I sat there, watching him laugh at his own jokes while dipping fries into sauce, I realized that unless I changed the script, he'd keep writing my story for me. The next few days blurred together. At work, I went through the motions, emails, calls, meetings about bean sourcing, but underneath, I carried this low-level static. It wasn't grief over Aaron, that part I'd accepted. It was the invasion, the loss of authorship over my own narrative. Every time someone glanced at me too long in the break room, I wondered if they had seen it, if they were silently replaying my breakup on their phones. You don't need millions of views to feel exposed. A dozen is enough when they're people you'll face tomorrow. Max didn't slow down. He doubled back with stories about the reach the stream had. "Dude, you wouldn't believe the comments," he said, waving his phone like a trophy. That's how opportunists operate. They harvest applause as justification. If you've ever known someone who can't distinguish attention from affection, you've seen this pattern. It's less about malice, more about hunger, insatiable, restless hunger. Jung might call it the shadow of the performer archetype, the desperate need to be seen, even if it burns the people closest to them. I caught myself analyzing him more than confronting him. That's the trap. We think if we just understand someone deeply enough, we'll excuse them. But insight isn't a substitute for boundaries. Maybe you've been there, making allowances because that's just how he is. That phrase, repeated enough, becomes permission slips. And permission slips pile up until you realize your dignity is the currency. One night, I rewatched the stream, not because I wanted to, but because avoiding it gave it more power. Aaron looked weary, but composed. I, on the other hand, looked like a man trying too hard to stay likable while my world cracked. It was painful, but clarifying. I could see the patterns that had kept me silent for years, nodding, placating, smiling when I should have drawn lines. The live stream wasn't just an intrusion, it was a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. They show you what others already see. I started pulling back from Max, not with a dramatic announcement, but with small acts of distance. I let his calls roll to voicemail, answered his texts hours later with clipped replies, and stopped inviting him to casual hangouts. It wasn't a strategy at first, just fatigue. But even silence can be a kind of statement, and people like Max hear it louder than words. He showed up at my office one afternoon, balancing 2 iced coffees like bribes. My coworkers raised eyebrows as he strolled in, casual as ever. "Man, you're ghosting me," he said, too loud for the space. That's the performer's move. Make the private public, so you're forced to engage on their stage. If you've ever had a friend who calls you out in front of others, you know the feeling. It's less about the words and more about control. I pulled him into the hallway and said plainly, "You can't just keep crossing lines and act like it's nothing. I need space." He blinked, surprised, as though boundaries were foreign currency. Then came the deflection. "Space? From what?" I was just trying to lighten the mood. That's how chronic boundary pushers twist it. They recast intrusion as kindness. So if you resist, you look ungrateful. Driving home later, I replayed it all. Why did I still feel guilty for standing up for myself? That's the pleaser's reflex. Confuse self-protection with selfishness. But guilt is a poor compass. Jung would argue that when you deny your anger, it doesn't disappear. It festers in the shadow, showing up as resentment, headaches, sleepless nights. I was done feeding it. That evening, I sat in my quiet apartment. No stream, no audience, no chatter. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt less like emptiness and more like clarity. Yet clarity isn't resolution. It's just the moment you see the fork in the road. And I knew Max wasn't going to let go easily. Sure enough, Max didn't fade. He pivoted. When I stopped responding to his texts, he shifted to social media. Posts cropped up with captions like, "Some people can't handle honesty," paired with vague photos of empty chairs or half-eaten meals. That's the passive-aggressive performance. Tell the world without naming names, so the audience fills in the blanks. If you've been in that spot, you know how it feels, like someone writing a script where you're cast without consent. I tried to ignore it, but ignoring public narratives doesn't erase them. It just lets others write the ending. Colleagues asked cautious questions. Friends tiptoed around me with sympathy I hadn't asked for. The story had grown legs beyond my control. And here's the hard truth. Once your private life is externalized, you can't fully reclaim it. You can only decide how much of yourself you'll give away from that point forward. I started journaling, not because I loved writing, but because I needed a record that was mine. One night, flipping back through entries, I noticed how often the word permission appeared. I had been granting it unconsciously. Permission for Max to record, for Aaron to set the pace, for strangers to comment on my face as if it were stock footage. And I wondered, how often do you do the same? How many little permissions slip past you daily, unnoticed, until someone builds a tower out of them? Psychologically, Max embodied the trickster's descent, charm weaponized into disruption. But what shook me wasn't his archetype. It was realizing I'd been cast as the passive observer, too afraid to assert authorship of my own life. That role is comfortable, but it corrodes slowly. The next time Max called, I didn't let it go to voicemail. I answered steady and told him to meet me face to face, not for reconciliation, for clarity. Some conversations can't be avoided forever, and I was done being background in my own story. We met at a taco place off South Congress, the kind of spot where the music is loud enough to blur private words, but not loud enough to drown tension. Max showed up grinning, phone in hand, already filming the neon lights. Performers don't clock out, they stay on, even at dinner tables. Watching him line up a shot of chips and salsa, I felt a strange mix of anger and pity. Anger at the intrusion, pity at the emptiness driving it. You probably know someone like this, unable to exist without documenting themselves, as though life only counts when witnessed. I told him straight, "You can't keep turning me into content. That's not friendship." He laughed, leaned back, and said, "Man, you're taking this too seriously. People loved it. They felt connected. Isn't that the point of life, connection?" That's the trick, isn't it? Wrap exploitation in lofty words until it sounds noble. But connection without consent isn't connection, it's theft. And if you've ever had your story told without your permission, you know how violating that feels. Max wasn't hearing me. He kept pushing, calling me uptight, saying I was lucky people cared. That's the performer's defense. Frame the spotlight as a gift, even if it blinds you. But archetypes don't excuse behavior, they just explain it. Jung would say the performer fears invisibility more than anything, and they'll sacrifice relationships to avoid it. What they don't realize is that in chasing visibility, they often vanish as real people. I paid for my tacos halfway through the meal, stood up, and said quietly, "We're done. Don't contact me again." His face shifted, not anger, not sorrow, but confusion, as though I'd broken a rule he thought we both agreed to. Walking out, I expected guilt, maybe regret. What I felt instead was lighter, like dropping a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Yet clarity doesn't erase consequences. By the next morning, Max had already posted a story about fake friends and haters who can't handle the truth. And just like that, my choice became public theater again. The ripple was immediate. Friends started forwarding me screenshots, asking if I was okay, what had happened, why Max was suddenly vague posting about betrayal. It was surreal. My personal boundaries turned into a spectator sport. That's the danger of performers. When you refuse to play your assigned role, they rewrite the script and hand it to the crowd. And if you've ever been painted as the villain in someone else's story, you know the helpless frustration of watching people debate a version of you that isn't real. At work, I noticed colleagues whispering when I passed. Not malicious, just curious, curiosity fueled by spectacle. It reminded me how quickly narrative spreads when drama is involved. I managed PR for a living, yet I couldn't manage my own reputation. That irony burned. But it also forced me to ask, how much of our self-image depends on other people's perceptions, and how much is grounded in what we refuse to compromise? I stopped defending myself in group chats and DMs. Explanation is a trap. Once you start justifying your boundaries, you've already lost authority over them. Instead, I kept things brief. Yeah, I'm fine. I just needed distance. No details, no counter-narrative. Silence unnerved Max more than rebuttal ever could. In the quiet, I started to see patterns beyond him. The people who checked in without prying, the ones who respected my short replies, those were allies. The ones who pressed for gossip, who said, "Come on, just tell me what really happened." They weren't interested in me, only in the story. That distinction, once visible, was impossible to unsee. Maybe you've noticed it too, how crisis reveals who values you as a person and who values you as content. One evening, sitting on my balcony, I realized Max had given me something unintentionally. By turning me into a spectacle, he forced me to reckon with how fragile my boundaries had been. And while his posts kept echoing into the digital void, I felt myself stepping out of it, choosing, for once, to live unrecorded. The storm didn't vanish overnight. Max kept tossing sparks online, but without me to fuel them, they fizzled. People moved on, as they always do. Outrage is a firework, loud, bright, and quickly forgotten. What lingers is the residue, the quiet way you rethink your choices. I started noticing how often I'd bitten my tongue in other parts of life. At work, I'd agree to extra projects just to avoid disappointing anyone. With family, I'd swallow irritation to keep the peace. Max wasn't an outlier. He was a mirror of every place I'd abandoned myself for harmony. That realization stung, but it also cracked something open. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole by integrating the parts of ourselves we deny. My denied part was anger, not explosive rage, but the steady fire of self-respect. I had treated it like a flaw, when really it was a compass pointing toward my limits. If you're always smoothing over tension, you might think you're being kind, but often, you're just erasing yourself. Erin reached out once, weeks later. She said she'd heard bits about the live stream, but hadn't watched. "I'm sorry that happened," she told me. Her tone was gentle, not pitying. We talked for 10 minutes, about her classes starting, about my work, and then hung up. No lingering strings, no reopening of wounds. It struck me how different that conversation felt compared to anything with Max. Real connection doesn't demand an audience. It respects silence. I deleted my own social accounts for a while. Not permanently, just enough to detox from the hum of other people's eyes. In that pause, I found myself walking more, reading again, cooking without photographing the plate. Simple things, but grounding. You don't realize how much of life gets staged until you step out of the performance. But stepping out comes with a choice. Once you see the pattern, how easily people turn each other into material, you can't unsee it. The question becomes, do you ever let them back in? Or do you build a life where the script belongs entirely to you? Months later, I ran into Max at a friend's birthday gathering. He looked the same, camera in hand, scanning the room, like every face was potential content. He greeted me with an awkward half smile, maybe expecting reconciliation. but something had shifted in me. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel guilt. I just felt distance, like watching a play you'd once acted in, but now only recognize as fiction. That's the thing about boundaries. Once they're real, you don't need to announce them. They carry themselves. We exchanged a few polite words, nothing more. He tried to bring up the past. Crazy times, huh? But I let it drop, not with malice, just disinterest. Performers feed on reaction, and indifference is a language they can't translate. If you've ever withheld your energy from someone who thrived on it, you know the quiet power of simply not giving them the stage. Walking home, I thought about how much that whole episode had cost me. Embarrassment, fractured friendships, weeks of unease. But it had also bought me something harder to measure. Clarity about the roles we play. I had been the passive observer, the pleaser, the one who valued peace over presence. That part of me didn't vanish, but it no longer ran the show. Jung might say I had integrated a sliver of my shadow, learning that anger can be protective, not destructive. Life since then hasn't been free of spectacle. People still overshare, still blur lines, still treat others' lives as entertainment. But I move differently now. I choose when to speak, when to stay silent, when to step off stage entirely. The difference isn't in the world. It's in how I hold myself inside it. And maybe that's the quiet victory, realizing your story doesn't need an audience to be worth living.